Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and I am joined today by fellow therapist, friend, and author Jay Stringer to talk about how our stories affect our sexuality. So, Jay, welcome back. It's good to have you again with us.
Adam, it's always such a gift to be here with another fellow author. That was not true last time we spoke.
That's right. Okay, we're going to talk.
You're moving on quick.
I'm moving on quick. I'm very proud of my book, and I'm very pleased that I'm now an author like you. But let's talk about the very fraught subject of sexuality today. And I want to begin by inviting everyone to attend an upcoming conference that we are doing on this very important subject. We've been doing the Sexual Attachment Conference every year in May. This is the fourth year, and it's coming up May 3rd, 2025. You can attend for the first time ever this year. You can actually attend in person. If you live in or want to fly to Mesa, Arizona, which is outside of Phoenix, it's going to be held at Ironwood Church in Mesa, Arizona. But if you can't make it there, of course, you can attend virtually because the entire conference is going to be live streamed. And here's what I want to begin with. Jay, you talk about frequently that at some point in our lives, we all encounter challenges with regard to our sexuality, whether it's compulsive, unwanted sexual behavior, or whether it's struggling to feel any sexual desire at all in my body. So no matter where people find themselves, the Sexual Attachment Conference is designed to help you uncover the attachment dynamics from your growing up years that often keep you stuck in your present sexual struggles. And we all have present sexual struggles. I mean, nobody escapes sexual heartache, sexual pain. But I want to say this, even if you've been to the conference before, even if you've already attended, I want to invite you to consider coming again. Now, why? Why? Because the most important part of the conference, in my opinion, it's not the information that the speakers convey, although we believe that we have something really important to say. But the most important part of the conference experience is what comes up inside of you, the participant, as you are listening. In other words, what happens inside of your heart, your mind, as you are engaged for a day. I mean, give your sexuality a day in the process of reflecting on your sexual story and your sexual struggles. And that's going to be different every year because we are all in the process of growing. So with that as an invitation right at the beginning for everyone, let's talk some, Jay, just about the whole realm of sexual struggles, sexuality, our sexual story. And maybe we can start with this. In our experience as therapists, we often have found that people have to have some sort of like sexual crisis or experience really high levels of sexual shame before they begin the work of looking at their sexual story. And I just want to start with, why do you think this is the case, and does it have to be that way?
Yes, so it is such a heartbreaking reality that, sexual problems, part of the way that I would put it is that sexual problems are normal in this day and age, but they are never random. And that's the really important point, is that sexual problems, we know from the research that about a third of all marriages will experience some level of infidelity. We know that, 60 to 70% of men are struggling or will struggle with porn. That rate is about 30 to 40% for women. Some of us will experience things like low sexual desire or hyposexual desire disorder, and that occurs in somewhere between 10 to 30% of individuals. Sexual pain disorders, erectile dysfunction, like all of us at some point in our lives are going to experience some level of sexual difficulty. And one of the main problems that we experience with this culturally is that so many of us have not ever been invited to understand our own sexual story, have never received the sex education that we desired and deserved. I think Harvard University did a study that basically showed that like young adults between the ages of 18 to 25, it was like 70 or 80% of them longed for so much more in terms of conversations with their parents than what they received. And so
Mm.
all of us are arriving into our adult life very underdeveloped, without the knowledge, without the understanding that we have. And one of the best quotes on all of this comes from a depth psychologist by the name of Bill Plotkin. And essentially, what he says is that, we tend to develop in a way that is fairly underdeveloped or overly hardened. And what he says is that if we had had elders in our life, they would have provided some level of initiatory experience to soften us, to crack us open. But here's the key point that he says. He says, without those elders, the soul will wait for or create a trauma or something extreme so that our old way of belonging to the world can finally begin to unravel. So part of what I experience pretty consistently in my work is that sometimes there is some level of sexual difficulty that really cracks someone open. That could be because they don't want to want, because there's something about sexuality that has become very dangerous to them because of past experiences, or at some level, part of what they have experienced is that something like pornography or a hookup was really one of their earliest attachments. And if that is one of your earliest attachments, that's going to affect the way that you organize your life as a result. And so, Adam, just, I would probably start quoting you right now if I wasn't even talking to you. But as I was going through your book for an endorsement, uh, this is from your new book, Make Sense of Your Story, and this is on page 151. But you go on, you're comparing these two guys that are looking at porn. One guy is Michael, the other is Isaiah. I can't remember who is who, but essentially what you say is this: priming refers to the likelihood that a particular neural networks will fire in the present based on past experiences. Priming is why choice is not the same for people. And so, what you're highlighting there is that two different people's choices to use pornography may be entirely different depending on the priming of their life. So, part of what our work is doing, and especially this conference, is going to invite people to say, what are the primary stories that primed you in the way that you relate to sex, in the way that you relate to porn, in the way that you want to be desired, in the way that you don't want to be desired. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about just what you have learned about priming, because that's a lot of what we are dealing with as therapists is what attachments, what storylines have been primed within a person before they get to us in a particular crisis moment.
Yeah. Priming is so important, and not just with regard to sexuality, but just with regard to all of life. And what we mean by priming is that you have neurons in your brain, and priming refers to the tendency of neural networks to fire in the present based on past experiences. And so, somebody that grew up in a very sexualized home, for example, is going to have a different set of neural networks than someone who grew up in a home where there was little to no sexualization. And that's just something that all of us need to come to terms with. We need to come to terms with the fact that we have neurons, and our neurons have been primed to anticipate what's going to happen later this afternoon based on our past experiences. So there's a linkage between your present experiences with regard to your sexuality and your past experiences, particularly of sexual harm. That's what the idea of priming is getting at. What I really want people to understand is that priming should provoke compassion. It should provoke curiosity. It should provoke kindness from you to you. Because when we have sexual shame, when we have sexual struggles, we often feel loads of self-contempt, self-accusation that often turns into some measure of hopelessness and despair. And the idea of priming should provoke all of us, invite all of us to some level of like compassion and curiosity about, okay, so this is what my sexual struggles are like. Maybe there's a, like you said, it's not random. Maybe there's a good reason for this that can be mined by looking at my sexual story.
And I think two of the primary ways that we are often primed are family of origin and the cultural context that we come from or are embedded within. And so that would just be one of those, questions to begin to ask yourself is, what type of home did I come from? Did I come from a home that was fairly disengaged? Did I come from a home that was very, very rigid? Did I come from a home that was emotionally enmeshed? And those are going to provide some of those first initial clues because, part of what ends up happening with a very rigid home is that you might have a mother or a father who is just a master at creating context for you to feel humiliated and powerless in life. And if that's part of your core experience, your relationship to something like porn or a hookup is going to be very, very different from someone who had a secure attachment to their parent. Why? Because if you are embedded within a powerless system, one of the reasons why porn will become appealing to you is that it gives you maybe the first experience of power that you have ever had in your entire life. Or let's think about the priming that if you came from a disengaged family home, if you had never experienced attunement, kindness, someone who delighted in you, you are going to arrive into adulthood likely scanning the horizon, looking for someone, looking for you, pining after someone. And so some of my clients, at least in some of the earlier years of my licensure hours when I was working with community mental health and people that were basically dual diagnosis of substance abuse disorders and just so much trauma and PTSD. One of the things that they would often describe to me is when they had heroin for the first time or when they had meth for the first time, it was something like a warm hug. It was this experience that in their body was the first real sense of attachment and connection that they had. So again, back to that priming example that you used is we have to assess what has been the nature of our family of origin, what's the culture that we come from, and what are the ways that they have primed us for some of the unique struggles that we are facing. And this is not to blame purity culture, it's not to blame our parents, but it's to be able to say if we cannot ask, if we cannot take responsibility for where we come from, we are very likely never going to take responsibility for how we show up in the world. And so honesty is like a muscle that develops the more that you use it. And so that's really what we're after is we've got to address the priming so that we can actually step into matters of integrity and choice with so much more integrity, so much more kindness than we typically do.
Yeah, and so those are the two words that I really want to invite people to ponder: curiosity and kindness. I mean, what would it look like for you to bring some curiosity and some kindness to exploring your sexuality, your sexual struggles? In your book Unwanted, you point out that there are always two storylines at play in someone's sexual life. There's the storyline of our present sexual struggles, and we all have them. And then there's the storyline of your growing up experiences, which set you up, or to use your word, primed you neurobiologically for your present sexual struggles. There's a connection, in other words, between our painful growing up experiences, particularly experiences of sexual harm, and our present sexual lives. And so you can take any person's particular struggle and draw an arrow from that struggle directly back to particular moments in your past story. Why? Because you have neurons, and that's all you have is neurons. And therefore, there's a relationship between the past and the present. And so, your sexual difficulties in the present, I would say, are largely a function of your attachment wounds from the past. And we're going to get into the whole category of attachment at the conference. But let me just say this as kind of prelude to the conference. Securely attached people experience sexuality differently than avoidantly attached people and differently than ambivalently attached people. And I'm not going to get into attachment styles right now. We don't have time to do that. But let me just say a few words, okay? I'm an ambivalently attached man. And when you are ambivalently attached, and if this language is new to you, we're going to go into it in great detail at the Sexual Attachment Conference. But if you're familiar with the language and you know, hey, I'm ambivalently attached, well, that has implications for your sex life, all right? Your sex life is likely going to be largely about reassuring yourself that you're truly loved by your partner and that they are responsive to your needs, your desires, your longings. And therefore, if you're ambivalently attached and your spouse says no to sex or says no to what you want to do sexually, you'll likely experience some degree of anxiety or even panic. It may be mild, it may be severe. Why? Because as far as your nervous system is concerned, your spouse, your partner, they're not only saying no to sex, they're communicating to you. This is how you receive it, okay? That they don't really care about you and your desires. And this triggers your anxiety that your partner's not really there for you. You can't rely on them to meet your needs and wants. Okay, that's ambivalent attachment. Now, what about for avoidantly attached folks? Well, you're apt, this is just one example, all right? There's a lot that can be said, but one example is you're apt to avoid, if you're avoidantly attached, emotional closeness during sex. The emotional closeness is something, sex itself may not be a problem for you, just sex with someone that you are in an emotionally committed relationship with, like your spouse. Why? Why is it so challenging for you to enjoy and connect emotionally with your spouse? Because you have an emotional connection with that particular person. All right? You're in an emotionally committed relationship with them. Again, this, you can see the implications for pornography, for affairs. You're not in an emotionally committed relationship with those people. But with your spouse, sex with your spouse, it requires emotional intimacy. And emotional closeness is frightening for you if you're avoidantly attached because it connects you to your very understandable unmet needs for emotional connection with your parents, which just wasn't there in the case of avoidant attachment. So that was just a little bit about avoidant, ambivalent attachment and sex. Now, I want to talk just for a bit, Jay, with you. There's a part in Unwanted where, let me just quote it, and then I'm going to ask you a question. You say, and this is probably my favorite sentence from Unwanted. Despite the overwhelming grip of shame and guilt, I do not believe that sexual fantasies are something to condemn. Sexual arousal is one of the greatest gifts God has given us, and we do not need to spend a lifetime annihilating it. Now, that just, when I read that, something in me released. Why do many of us get stuck in a war with our sexual arousal, with our sexual desire? And why do many of us respond to our sexual struggles by either trying to kill our desire, like make it go away, or letting our desire, flame and go wherever it wants to take us, wherever it wants to go? Why is that the tendency?
So one of the things that I would want us to think about is, you have your big six that every child needs. I think that's in your second episode that you go over that, of the place we find ourselves. So I would strongly encourage people to go back to that. But also, Dan Siegel talks about, that basically the four things that every child needs are these four S's: to be seen, to be safe, to be soothed, and secure. And so I think for a lot of us, we need to go back to some of these early experiences of desire that, in the words of Kurt Thompson, we grow up looking for someone looking for us, and this never stops. And so that sense of like when we grew up, did you have a mother or father who saw your desires, saw the things that brought you so much life and so much delight? And also, what we needed to be seen in is a sense of our own heartache and sadness. And, did you have a mother or a father who were attuned to you when you had a really hard day in high school and you came home and just never wanted to return back to school? Did they see you in that? And so I think what ends up happening to a lot of us is that our sexuality, our sexual desire, will often become a place that we really want to be seen. Or to borrow the other S language of soothed, that sometimes for us an orgasm or some experience of someone really wanting us and desiring us feels so strong. And so those are deeply, deeply vulnerable desires that are embedded within each of us. But then, as we go through life, we tend to look at those desires and we say, if I wasn't such a needy kid, if I didn't
Mm.
want so many things, then I just wouldn't be in this place. And so then we end up, pursuing a hookup, we begin to pursue porn, we do something. And what that does is create something of evidence against us that we are broken or flawed. And so rather than really honoring that there is a beauty in our desire for connection, our desire for sex, our desire for, we would rather go and in many ways in our adult life trash those desires and create evidence that we are really broken and disturbed. And so I think that's really the invitation that I want people to consider, is that shame and beauty will both vie for the right to narrate our life. And so if we only begin to see ourselves through that lens of judgment, that is going to shape the trajectory of our life. And that's the key point that I'm making in Unwanted, is that, we don't go back to these behaviors because it's a form of self-medicating or because we are just lonely. Far more, we are creating evidence against ourselves that our core belief about who we are is correct. And so I think that's the invitation of, sex and arousal, is that it's just so easy to begin to condemn some of our desires rather than go back and really bless the origins of how beautiful, how vulnerable those desires were.
I love that. I loved your words, but I loved your tone of voice. Like your posture, it's not just inviting, but it is so countercultural, at least for the way that I have experienced how sexuality is typically engaged in a lot of my Christian contexts that I grew up in. Like the kindness in your voice, the invitation to blessing rather than annihilation of my sexual desire is just so freeing. And again, the word that comes to mind for me is release. Something in me releases, and it makes room for a different way forward. Like there's a way forward with that level of kindness and that level of invitation. And again, this is why we do the sexual attachment conference. Because we want to invite you into a different posture towards your own sexual struggles and your own sexuality. So, in addition to you and me, Jay, we're also going to be having Sheila Ray Gregoire join us. And she's the author of The Great Sex Rescue. She's also just co-authored a book with her husband on marriage. And let's just close today by giving people a little bit of a preview of the conference. I'm going to begin the day by teaching about attachment, secure attachment, ambivalent, avoidant attachment, How do you know which one you are? What does it mean if you're ambivalently or avoidantly attached? And I will talk about in detail those 6 things that you needed from your parents, that every child, I call them the big 6, that every child needs from their parents to develop a secure attachment. And by looking at those 6 areas, you'll get a very good idea of how you attached to your parents, which sets you up for sexuality as an adult. So that's going to be the beginning of the day. And then, Jay, will you share a little bit, not just about what you're going to teach, but a little bit about what Sheila's going to engage as well?
So, one of the things that I'm going to be talking about is inviting people to really understand the meaning of their sexual fantasies. So, the example that I often will provide is from Harry Potter, where Harry looks into the mirror of Erised, which is desire spelled backwards. And as the orphan, what Harry sees is an image of his parents. And so, what the mirror of Erised is really offering to Harry is his most ardent longing or wish. And so that is one of the categories that I'm going to invite people to consider their sexual fantasies from, because again, sexual fantasies are normal, but they are not random. And so we want to help people to really understand their sexual mind. So similar to you, Adam, I grew up in evangelical culture, Presbyterian culture, and was just never really invited to understand my sexual mind. And so when you have a passage like Romans 12:2 that says, do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, as a Christian growing up in the 90s, early 2000s, it was very, very clear of like, this is what we should not be conformed to in the world, but almost no discipleship, no spiritual formation with regard to what was happening inside of our own sexual mind. And so that is really one of the tasks that I have during this conference, is to help us to understand what's going on in our sexual mind. And what I can promise you is that you are going to be fascinated by this. I know it's somewhat intimidating, probably, if you've never thought about really diving deep into your sexual mind, but I promise you this will open up doors and insights that you are going to be deeply grateful for in the long run. So I'll talk about some of that. And then part of what we are inviting Sheila to talk about is some of the ways that, Christian teachings get misused, and some of the ways that that often will create a sense of low desire for various partners. And so one of the things that Sheila will often talk about is that your desire level is the symptom. It's not the problem. And I think that that's a really good language for us to consider, is that some of us have been pathologized for having too much desire or having far too little desire in our estimation. And so, one of the things from her new book that I know that she'll touch on is she says, this line that you shouldn't prioritize sex in your marriage. And then you're like, what? That goes against everything that I've been told. But then she goes on to say, but what you should prioritize are the ingredients that make for great sex, not the frequency. And so Sheila is, just has so many great research studies and insights with regard to how so many of our marriages are obsessed with the frequency of sex far more than what are the ingredients, what are the dynamics that are occurring within it. And so she's really going to speak to just some of those relational dynamics that are at play with regard to the symptom of our desire level. So I love her content, and I think whatever she also speaks on will, it's always so challenging and refreshing.
Mm-hmm. So here's what I want to end with is whether you feel like your sexual desire is out of control and your sexual behaviors are out of control, or if you feel like, hey, I would really like to have more sexual desire than I do, and I can't seem to find it. Like, regardless of where you are on that spectrum, this conference is designed to help you connect the dots between your present sexual life and your past sexual story. Because as Jay said at the beginning, it's not random. Struggles are not random. They make sense because we have neurons. That's just how our nervous system is designed. It makes sense. So if you're interested, you can sign up by going to sexualattachment.com. You can also go to my website, adamyoungcounseling.com, and find a link there. And we would love for you to join us on May 3rd, either virtually or in person in Mesa, Arizona. Jay, before we end, is there anything you want to add? Parting words.
Yes. One of the ways, Adam, that I've heard you talk about this conference is that you once said that this is the conference you wish you had when you were growing up. And I feel the same way. I think that that is really why this conference has been so well received over the last years, and over the last 4 years, and why we keep doing it, is that this is the content that so many of us wish that we had and we were never given. And so if you really want some great teaching that's really going to help you to understand your sexual story, we would love to have you there. And I also think, you do it for yourself and you attend because you want to grow, but also just that dynamic, Adam, when you were talking about the sense of being preoccupied and ambivalently attached, and just thinking about, like, what would it be like to be married to someone that is anxious and ambivalently attached, which I am as well. And I know that there is so much of the ways that my sexual energy might show up in terms of entitlement, or might show up in terms of reassurance. And I think that that is a higher level of invitation to all of us, is to be able to say all of us are putting out particular energy, and that could be entitled, that could be just more hiding. And so, we want you to engage your own sexual story for yourself, but also do it for your partner as well. The more healthy you become in this area, the better sex that you're going to have. And so, again, just that sense of, this is a really great conference if you've never received some of this information, but also it's a really great conference to attend with your partner, because it's going to give you just a lot to talk about as a couple.
Yes. Thank you for that, Jay. Great to have you. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Adam, always so good to be here. Thank you.